Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing a San Jose Sharks 22-23 prospect update video with the somewhat recent conclusion of the NHL regular season, as well as the conclusion of many regular seasons around the hockey world. It seemed as though it was as good a time as any to take a look at how some of these Sharks prospects have performed over the past year, how some of their developments have gone, whether these are players just recently added to the Sharks organization or players who have been in the organization for a couple of years. It's definitely a good time to look at their progress. Now, of course, the big thing to note here, as you'll notice by the list of players, is that I'm making sure not to include any player who has played even a single game with the San Jose Sharks at the NHL level. That means there is no William Eklund, there is no Thomas Bordeleau, no Henry Thrun, Daniil Gushin, Tristan Robbins. All of those players will likely be discussed in a future video detailing the younger players who made their debuts with the San Jose Sharks. Otherwise, if I were to include those players, this video would go on forever, so it's more important to try and sort of separate the still in the system prospects compared to the potential NHL option prospects, I would say. And so starting off in this list, we have Philip Bystedt. Of course, a very interesting story about how Philip Bystedt was brought to the San Jose Sharks. He was drafted in the 2022 NHL entry draft. That was the draft in which Mike Grier was only hired, at least officially, a couple of days earlier, and his big move was to trade down from 11th overall to 27th overall, as well as picking up the 34th and 45th overall picks in that deal as well. And this was an extremely controversial move, as moving down from 11th to 27th obviously is 16 spots, and it looks pretty bad on paper, at least like a pretty good drop on paper, but it might even be somewhat underrated of just how significant a drop this is. A lot of people will realize the obvious difference between, let's say, a first overall pick and a 32nd overall pick, but as you get closer to the middle part of that first round draft, a lot of people just sort of view it as a, pick 20, pick 20 is not that much different from pick 25, which is not that much different from pick 13 or anything like this. But actually, a 16 pick drop in the first round is quite significant, especially if you were to compare it to, let's say, a 16 pick drop in the 6th round. If we take a look at the 10 draft years from 2010 to 2019, which was essentially the last decade of drafts, at a point where we can realistically evaluate which players will make it to the NHL and which will not. They've all had at least a decent amount of time to be able to make their mark. Taking a look at 11th overall, 8 of the 10 players drafted during this time have at least played more than a handful of games at the NHL level, and this also includes star players like Philip Forsberg, Kevin Fiala, as well as Jack Campbell. On the 27th overall side, only about 4 of the 10 players drafted over this time span actually ended up playing more than a handful of games in the NHL, and the best of those 4 players was likely Vladislav Namestnikov, who Sharks fans will remember was a San Jose Shark for a couple of days, as he was traded 1-for-1 to the Tampa Bay, or with the Tampa Bay Lightning, for Mikey Eyssimont, and then traded to the Winnipeg Jets a couple of days later for a 4th round pick. And I would think that a player like Philip Forsberg, drafted 11th overall, would be worth at least a bit more than that 4th round pick. In fact, you have to go all the way back to 2008 before you find a star player drafted at 27th overall. And so 11th to 27th is a pretty significant drop. And then on top of that, Philip Bystedt wasn't necessarily a player who was expected to be picked at 27th, and was a bit off the board, more of a 2nd round pick expected. And so it was not only a surprise the drop, but also the exact player drafted. And yet, over this past season, it has looked pretty good and has panned out rather well for Mike Grier in the Swedish Elite League, the SHL here, the top league in Sweden. He's had a rather solid season for a player as young as he is. 45 games played, 7 goals, 13 assists for 20 points, but obviously the big talk when it comes to Philip Bystedt is the World Juniors. The World Juniors is an opportunity to really show yourself on the big stage to the common hockey fan, who will be much more willing and likely and able to watch a World Juniors game broadcasted, very often, compared to an SHL game with the massive time difference and everything like that. And so this is an opportunity for many rookies, many of these younger players in these NHL systems to actually shine. And Bystedt shined very, very brightly, obviously, if not for the big performances of a player like Connor Bedard with the Canadian national team, Bystedt definitely would have stood out as one of the best players at the tournament, and I believe he was definitely at least one of the top players for Sweden, if not their best player during that tournament. So a fantastic look for Bystedt, and he is suddenly potentially a top 3 or at the very least top 5 prospect for the San Jose Sharks, and definitely a lot better than he was expected to be when he was drafted at 27th overall about last year. And so this ends up being a pretty decent trade, especially when you look at a couple of the other players drafted with the 34th and 45th. Speaking of that 45th, we have Matthias Havlid, also a player on the exact same team as Bystedt in the SHL. 25 games played, 4 goals, 2 assists, and 6 points. These numbers obviously don't jump off the page hugely, but it should be noted, first of all, that Havlid is a defenseman, and second of all, he was injured for a large chunk of this season. In fact, the reason why he wasn't also at the World Juniors for Sweden with Bystedt is because of that injury, and it kept him out of it. But 6 points playing in the top Swedish league at the age that he is at is quite impressive, especially when you do indeed consider that he is a defenseman. As we know, defensemen, they take a bit longer to develop than forwards. That offensive skill usually comes faster than a sort of defensive responsibility, and that is much more important for a defenseman than for a forward. And so Havlid, actually a pretty solid year for sure with the Swedish team, and we'll see for both of these players, Bystedt and Havlid, whether they make the transition to the AHL for the San Jose Sharks, or if, for instance, like Eklund did over not this past season but the year before that, if they return to Sweden for yet another year before making that transition. Then we have Cam Lund. He was picked 34th overall at the 2022 draft, a centerman who played in college this season, the NCAA. 35 games, 7 goals, 16 assists for 23 points. A pretty solid freshman year for Lund for sure. To put this into perspective with another Sharks prospect who played in the NCAA recently, that would be Thomas Bordeleau. In his freshman year, in about 24 games, he put up 30 points. And you might be wondering, well, 30 points from Bordeleau, that's a point per game over 24. Lund isn't even necessarily all that close to a point per game. Is Lund even anywhere close to as good as Bordeleau? Well, it should be noted that Bordeleau did play with the University of Michigan, which featured big names like Owen Power, Matty Beniers, Kent Johnson, Brendan Brisson, all of these players who at this point, or almost all of these players at this point, are making a very big name for themselves at the NHL level. Matty Beniers is very much a Calder candidate, if not a Calder favorite this season with the Seattle Kraken, and so Bordeleau had a lot more good players with him on that roster and a lot more help for sure compared to Lund, who was on Northeastern University, and no offense to the players that he was playing with, but none of their names necessarily jump off the page. So far, with the quality of teammates that he had, Lund in his freshman year actually played rather well. So the 2022 draft class looking pretty solid for the San Jose Sharks, and depending indeed, I mean, this is kind of a hindsight type of situation, but depending on how the 11th overall pick for the Arizona Coyotes does, which by the way is Connor Geekie, in case you want to follow that player, this may have ended up being a pretty solid trade for Mike Grier, as he went for the quantity over quality approach, and at the moment it's looking pretty decent. The next player we will discuss is Shakir Mukhamadullin, probably the most recent acquisition for the San Jose Sharks prospect-wise, or at least one of the most recent acquisitions for them, picked up in the Timo Meier trade from the New Jersey Devils. Of course, when it came to that trade, there was an obvious player who the Sharks were trying to get, which was a young prospect player who could potentially make an impact for themselves in a couple of years, and many Sharks fans were hoping that they could, at the very least, pick up a player like Alexander Holtz, but were maybe even hoping at the best of levels to try and get someone like Luke Hughes. That was going to be difficult, especially since his brother Jack Hughes plays with the New Jersey Devils, but Alexander Holtz seemed to be a lot of Sharks fans' primary target, but they end up with Shakir Mukhamadullin. Certainly not a bad prospect, but not one of the top prospects for the Devils. Of course, the thing is that the Devils had a significantly better prospect pool than the San Jose Sharks, so while he was not necessarily the best prospect the Devils had, coming over to San Jose immediately makes him a top 3 prospect for the Sharks, probably only behind Eklund at this point on the depth chart. Mukhamadullin, a defenseman who played in the KHL this season, the KHL likely the most competitive league in the world behind the NHL. So him being able to put up 25 points in the 67 games played that he had was rather impressive. It should also be noted that he was the highest scoring defenseman on that team and playing some pretty solid minutes in the KHL. His team would make it to the playoffs in that league, bow out in about 6 games, and he would then arrive in the AHL to play a few games with the Barracuda, where in the 12 games that he appeared in, he would manage 10 points, pretty close to a point per game output for Mukhamadullin. He is a bit older than the at least previous players who I talked about, Philip Bystedt, Matthias Havlid, Cam Lund, all at the 18 to 19 range. Mukhamadullin is 21 years of age as he was drafted in the 2020 entry draft, but it'll be very interesting to see what kind of impact Mukhamadullin at this point could make at the North American level. Will he be a Barracuda player for the San Jose Sharks next year, or will he potentially challenge for an NHL spot? It's going to be exceptionally difficult if we imagine a world in which Erik Karlsson stays put with the San Jose Sharks. Every single other San Jose Sharks defenseman who played in the final game of this season, I believe, is indeed under contract. Karlsson, Ferraro, Shemek, McDonald, Benning and Vlasic, all of these players will likely be with the San Jose Sharks unless they get moved or something, or bought out, I guess you could say. And so it's going to be difficult for Mukhamadullin, especially since Henry Thrun is another player looking to find a consistent spot with the San Jose Sharks. So indeed, we shall see. But he had a solid year in the KHL and brief stint in the AHL. Next on this list, we have a player who maybe doesn't have as high hopes, but is more so a cautionary tale, I guess you could say, to many of the future prospects for the San Jose Sharks, as well as the player pretty much right next to him on this list, and that would be Brandon Coe. For those who may not remember, Coe had an exceptional season in the OHL last year, over 100 points. I believe he was the leading point scorer in the OHL that year, and so a lot of fans were pretty hyped up about this player. But when I was discussing Coe over the entirety of last season, I always made sure to put that very important caveat that he was an overager at the OHL, and not only that, but he is a very, very big player. He's 6'4", he's, over 200 pounds. This is a player who absolutely can sort of just push his way around the ice and kind of just force his way to getting goals when playing against teenage players at the OHL. And the transition to the AHL, the pro level, was going to be rather difficult for him, and exactly difficult it was in the 56 games he played with the San Jose Barracuda. 5 goals, 11 assists for 16 points. Not a particularly strong output for a player that maybe some Sharks fans would have had hope for. So for Coe going forward, he is almost certainly not going to be an option for the San Jose Sharks themselves next year. He's definitely going to be much more of a Barracuda type of player, and he's going to have to work on more his fundamentals of the game, because when you're going up against other grown men who are, maybe even 10 years older than you at that point, you can't have that same type of outmuscle opportunity like you did against the 17-year-old that you played against in the OHL. So it's going to be definitely a big wake-up call season for Brandon Coe, and we'll see how he does going into the following year. And that brings me to Ethan Cardwell, recently signed to an entry-level contract by the San Jose Sharks, is currently in an ongoing OHL playoff series. At this point, I believe the second round against the North Bay Battalion with the Barrie Colts. He had 62 games played, 43 goals, 47 assists for 90 points. As importantly, once again, an overager. The slightly better news and sort of more positive side of this is that he doesn't have that same imposing size as Brandon Coe. He's, I believe, 5'11", so he's not just necessarily pushing people around, but still a 21-year-old man is going to be more physically developed than an 18 or even a 17-year-old boy. And so it's a situation in which Cardwell kind of has an innate advantage compared to a lot of the other players in this league, which is why his numbers do look very, very solid. This is not to say that Cardwell is going to go the exact same path as Coe and end up being just an AHL player who has a disappointing year next year, but it is to say to not necessarily get our hopes all that high. Hopefully Cardwell can be the sort of exception to that rule, and he has an exceptional AHL year next season, but I wouldn't necessarily, like I said, get my hopes up for that. Still, doing very well with the Barrie Colts for sure. And then finally, let us discuss a goaltender for the San Jose Sharks. There are a lot of goaltenders in the system for San Jose, but none necessarily shining all that brightly. But here we will be focusing on Benjamin Goodrow, drafted in the 2021 draft, plays in the OHL with the Sarnia Sting. Also, like Cardwell, is still in the playoffs with his team. In fact, the has been doing very, very well, but that's something I'll get to a bit later. Let us first discuss Benjamin Goodrow's stats for the regular season in the OHL, which obviously do not jump off the page. 44 games played, 24 wins, with a 3.09 and a .889 save percentage. Now, these numbers at the NHL level obviously would be quite bad, though if we take a look at Kaapo Kähkönen and James Reimer's numbers, he kind of fits right in with the San Jose Sharks brass. But when it comes to a comparison between the OHL and the OHL is significantly higher scoring, less so than it used to be because the NHL scoring has gone up as of late, but still higher. There are teams averaging more than 4 goals per game in the OHL, and even with these less than stellar stats from an NHL lens, the Sarnia Sting, the team that Benjamin Goodrow is on and played the majority of games with this season, ends up being the fifth team who has let in the least amount of goals in the OHL. So the team is definitely amongst the best when it comes to letting in goals, and Goodrow is a big reason for that. There is some positive and negative news when it comes to Benjamin Goodrow. The positive is the playoffs that I was talking about earlier. Like I said, he is still involved with the Sarnia Sting going into the third round after sweeping the second round, and his playoff statistics definitely do jump off the page. I believe he has about a 2.19 goals against average as well as a .918 save percentage, which would be rather good at an NHL level and is quite amazing for an OHL goaltender. But the bad news, the negative news, is going back to what I mentioned earlier on when discussing Philip Bystedt. The World Juniors is an opportunity for these younger players to make their names known on the big stage, and Goodrow was expected to be the Canadian starting goaltender for the Canada national squad, and usually Canada is expected to be able to make runs to the finals, if not win the entire tournament, and so Goodrow had an opportunity to be the guy to do that. But with a couple of bad games under his belt in the World Juniors, he ends up losing out in that battle and sitting on the sidelines watching his countrymen really be the backstop for the Canada national squad. And so a pretty disappointing World Juniors for Benjamin Goodrow. Still is making up for it with this playoff run with Sarnia, but is somewhat awkward for him for sure. Like I mentioned, it is a relatively crowded system of goaltenders for the San Jose Sharks, but the very big good news for Benjamin Goodrow is that there's not really any goaltending prospect or even any goaltender on the San Jose Sharks squad immediately with Kähkönen and Reimer who actually is a starting wall, which is sort of a not necessarily demotivator for a player, but makes you think that you're not necessarily going to be able to make an impact with this team. At this point, if Goodrow, plays exceptionally well over the next couple of years, who's to say that he can't be the starter for the San Jose Sharks in, let's say, the 24-25 or 25-26 season? Because it's not going to be Mäkiniemi or Strauss-Mann or Magnus Krona or Kaapo Kähkönen who are necessarily going to be standing in their way. So this is not just a message for Goodrow, but a message for all of the Sharks prospects, goaltending-wise, that all of them have the opportunity to really take the reins of this franchise, at least unless Mike Grier brings in a different look for a starting goaltender over these next couple of years. And so Goodrow is one of those players who does have that opportunity. But that will do it for this prospect update. The San Jose Sharks prospect tool has clearly undergone a massive upgrade over this past season, not only with the 2022 draft, but with the players acquired through trades this season, like Mukhamadullin, as well as the aforementioned, who has already played multiple games, Henry Thrun this season. And of course, the 2023 draft will only help improve the San Jose Sharks because at the minimum, they're going to have 6th overall pick, and they very well could end up with that 1st overall choice. Class dismissed.